we've explored the teachings of Jesus as tactics, blessings that confront, commands that disrupt, a kingdom ethic that resists empire without becoming it. But teachings alone don't threaten systems. It's when those teachings are lived publicly, provocatively, relentlessly, that the powers begin to take notice and maybe even tremble. Last week, we also looked at a theologian, Walter Wink, and we'll look at more of him in this episode. But he reminds us, Jesus rejected the myth of redemptive violence. He didn't resist with swords. He resisted with presence, with touch, with truth. Every healing was a protest. Every meal was a movement. Every confrontation was a mirror held up to the empire. This is revolution in motion. Not just preached, but practiced. Not just spiritual, but political. Not just personal, but public. I'm John, and this is Gospel Politic, where faith meets justice and the truth refuses to stay silent. Jesus didn't just teach revolution. He walked it. He touched it. He lived it. And that's when the trouble began. The Sermon on the Mount was dangerous enough, but when Jesus started healing on the Sabbath, eating with tax collectors, and flipping tables in the temple, the powers took notice. Here's Walter Wink. We looked at him last week. We're gonna really utilize a lot of his teachings with this episode, particularly. He has a lot, but man, this little dagger has been so influential for me. So, and I really think it's a really good intro to the idea that we're talking about, Jesus and Nonviolence, A Third Way by Walter Wink. But Walter Wink helps us name what is happening here. Jesus was rejecting the myth of redemptive violence. He was resisting domination systems, not by overpowering them, but by exposing them. Jesus did not advocate non-resistance. He advocated a way of standing up to evil without becoming evil. And this is the third way. Not fight, not flight, but creative confrontation. See, Jesus wasn't killed for being nice. We've said that so many times. But he wasn't killed, that Jesus, he's such a nice guy, get him. That wasn't the case. He was killed for being disruptive. Rome didn't crucify him for metaphors. They crucified him for movement. His actions threatened the religious establishment, which had become entangled with imperial power. He exposed their complicity. He disrupted their control, and he did it without raising a sword. Walter Wink teaches us that the powers, whether political, religious, or cultural, depend on domination and fear. They survive by convincing us that violence is the only way to resist. But Jesus offered another way. A way that unmasked the powers without mirroring them. A way that refused to be silent, but also refused to become what it opposed. And this is the revolution in motion. It's not passive, it's not violent, it's provocative, embodied, and deeply political. And just to back up on that, most of the revolutions we see in this world, in our history, the revolutionary, when they're successful, pretty soon become the tyrant, become the machine, become the very power that they themselves were hurt by and resisted. Jesus is unique in this. His revolution is a revolutionary way in which we can overcome the powers without the worst fate of becoming the same thing we resisted, right? Resist the evildoer without becoming evil yourself. So Jesus didn't resist with swords. He resisted with presence, with touch, with truth. So we move now from the teachings to his tactics, from the sermon to the streets, from the words to the wounds. Because the way of Jesus was never only spoken. It was lived, and it still threatens empire. Table turning, temple destruction. Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, Matthew 21:12. This wasn't a moment of rage. It was a calculated act of resistance. Jesus didn't lose control. He took control. He staged a public disruption in the most sacred space of the religious establishment. And he did it during Passover when the city was packed and Rome was watching. Domination systems are sustained by ritual, economy, and fear. And the temple had all three. Sacrifices mediated access to God. Well, that was controlled by elites. Money changers profited off the poor. Religious leaders enforced purity codes to maintain power. Jesus disrupted it all. And he didn't just flip tables, he flipped the narrative. He exposed the collusion between religion and the empire. He revealed that the sacred had been sold. Wink writes that Jesus' actions were theatrical provocations. I love that. Designed to unmask injustice. This wasn't vandalism, it was revelation. By turning tables, Jesus turned attention. He forced the question, what has religion become when it serves empire instead of God? He didn't call for violence. He called for vision. Again, he didn't flip the tables out of rage. He flipped them to reveal what religion had become. So this act, though, this temple demonstration, this act sealed his fate. The religious leaders began plotting. They actually already were kind of, not happy with him. But more importantly, Rome took notice. The cross at this point was already being carved because empire doesn't fear sermons. It fears disruptions. And Jesus disrupted the most protected space in the system. So what does that mean for us? Where are the tables that need turning? Where has religion become complicit in domination? Where do we need to stage a holy disruption? Because the way of Jesus is not just about comfort. It is about confrontation. And sometimes it means flipping what everyone else calls sacred. Jesus healed, but not quietly, not safely, not within the bounds of religious approval. He healed on the Sabbath. He touched lepers. He let bleeding women reach for him. He crossed boundaries that empire and religion had drawn to keep people out. These weren't just miracles. They were protests. The third way is about resisting domination without replicating it. It's about reclaiming agency in the face of oppression. And Jesus' healings did exactly that. He didn't ask permission. He didn't follow purity codes. He didn't wait for systems to approve. He acted. And in doing so, he restored dignity to those the system had discarded. Each healing was a confrontation. Each touch was a declaration. You belong. The Sabbath was sacred, but it had become a tool of control. When Jesus healed on the Sabbath, he wasn't just helping someone. He was challenging the system. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? He asked. And then he did it. He exposed the absurdity of a law that protected ritual over people. Wink reminds us, domination systems use law to maintain order. Jesus used love to disrupt it. In Jesus' world, lepers, bleeding women, and Gentiles were untouchable. To touch them was to become unclean yourself. But Jesus touched them anyway. He didn't just heal bodies, he healed belonging. He didn't just restore health, he restored humanity. And this is the third way. Not submission to exclusion, not violent overthrow, but radical embrace that exposes the injustice of exclusion itself. And we looked at the theology and the radical resistance that an idea of embrace has. We looked at Miroslav Volf last week on this. So empire thrives on control. Religion often reinforces it. And Jesus disrupted both. one healing at a time. He didn't just challenge theology, he challenged power. He did it with tenderness, with courage, with a hand extended across every boundary. Who are the untouchables in our world today? What systems still use purity to exclude? Where can healing become resistance? Because the way of Jesus is not just about compassion, it's about confrontation. And healing is one of its most powerful tactics. Jesus didn't just preach in synagogues. He preached at tables. And those tables were revolutionary. He ate with tax collectors, with sinners, with the ritually unclean, with the politically compromised. And every meal was a confrontation. In Jesus' world, meals were more than food. They were social contracts. Who you ate with defined your status, your purity, your allegiance. Well, Jesus shattered those contracts. He welcomed the wrong people. He broke the wrong rules. He made the table a place of resistance. Walter Wink reminds us, domination systems rely on exclusion to maintain control. Jesus used inclusion to dismantle that control. So every meal was an act of embrace. He didn't vet his guests. He didn't sanitize the space. He didn't protect his reputation. He broke bread with the broken, and in doing so, he broke the system. And that's the third way again. Not withdrawal from impurity, not violent rejection of the system, but radical hospitality that exposes the injustice of exclusion. In a world obsessed with purity, Jesus built his movement around shared meals. Then there was the Last Supper, a meal shared with betrayers, doubters, and deniers. A meal held in defiance of empire's looming violence. A meal that became a symbol of a new kingdom. So Jesus didn't host a war council. He hosted a dinner. And in that meal, he redefines power. Not dominion, but service. Not exclusion, but embrace. Not fear, but love. This is a symbolic inversion, a ritual that flips the meaning of power. And the church has often tamed the Eucharist. And for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with Christianity, the Eucharist or the communion is a sacred, it's ritual. There's elements to it. There's bread and there's wine, or if you're from fundamentalist evangelicalism, it's juice, right? But these represent the body of Jesus and the blood of Jesus. And this comes like kind of a reenactment of the original Last Supper. But the church has often tamed this. But in its origins, it was a protest. It was a declaration that empire does not own the table, that the poor are welcome, that the broken are fed, and that the crucified one still hosts the feast. To eat in remembrance of Jesus is to eat in defiance of empire. So we ask, who do we refuse to eat with? What tables have we made too clean? How can our meals become movements? Because the way of Jesus is not just preached in pulpits, it's practiced at tables, and every meal can be a revolution. Jesus healed. He fed. He embraced. He confronted. The empire responded the only way it knows how, with violence. Wink reminds us that domination systems are threatened by truth embodied. They can tolerate ideas. They can ignore words, but they can't ignore presence. Jesus didn't just speak about empire. He stood in its way, and the cross was empire's answer. Jesus was arrested, not for blasphemy, but for disruption. He disrupted the temple economy. He disrupted Sabbath law. He disrupted purity codes. He disrupted the illusion of peace under Rome. He was a threat to the status quo, and threats must be neutralized. Wink writes, the powers are not merely institutions, they are spiritual realities, and when confronted, they lash out. Jesus' trial was a performance, a ritual of humiliation, a public display of dominance. He was mocked, beaten, paraded, not just to punish him, but to warn others. Empire always makes a spectacle of resistance. It must prove that love cannot win, that truth cannot stand, that the cross is stronger than the kingdom. But Jesus refused to play that part. He didn't retaliate. He didn't plead and beg. He didn't mirror the violence. He absorbed it. And in doing so, he exposed it. Wink says the exposure of the myth of redemptive violence. Empire says violence saves, power protects, domination brings peace. Jesus says no, love saves, truth protects, mercy brings peace. The cross is not just a place of suffering, it's a place of revelation. It reveals what empire does to those who resist, and it reveals that empire cannot win. Empire always kills what it cannot control, but resurrection is the final protest. So resurrection is not just hope, it's defiance. It's the refusal to let empire have the last word. It's the vindication of the way that resists. The resurrection is God's refusal to legitimate the powers. Jesus didn't rise to escape. He rose to continue, to invite us into a resistance that death cannot stop. So we ask, what powers are we confronting? Where are we tempted to retaliate instead of reveal? How do we carry the cross, not as a burden, but as a banner? Because the way of Jesus is not just a path of peace, it's a confrontation with empire. And the cross is where the powers are unmasked. Jesus didn't just resist empire. He showed us how. Walter Wink calls it a third way, a path of resistance that refuses both submission and retaliation. It's creative. It's courageous. It's costly. And it's still available to us today. It looks like feeding the hungry in a system built on scarcity. It looks like forgiving in a culture addicted to vengeance. It looks like crossing boundaries in a world obsessed with purity. It looks like telling the truth when silence is safer. Resistance isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a quiet refusal. Sometimes it's a public disruption. Sometimes it's a shared meal, but it's always a choice to live the kingdom in the shadow of empire. Walter Wink warns us, history belongs to the people who refuse to become what they oppose. Jesus didn't mirror empire. He exposed it. He didn't dominate. He disrupted. He didn't exclude. He embraced. So we ask, what powers need unmasking in our world? Where can we practice the third way? How do we resist without becoming what we oppose? So this week, choose one act of resistance. Flip a table. Challenge a system that exploits your neighbor. Touch the untouchable. Restore dignity to someone excluded. Host a meal. Build community across boundaries. Tell the truth even when it costs you. Let me tell you a story. When I first became a disciple of Jesus, there was a man, and I'm going to give a shout out, Octavio. Octavio was a senior. I believe I was a sophomore. And then also one of my best friends, one of the best men at my wedding, Dr. Tony Stiff. I don't know if he's comfortable with me doing this, but these two older brothers took me and showed me the power of embrace. Because not only did they embrace me, but they also founded a ministry on embrace. And so my first experience with ministry, my first experience in bringing Jesus to others was to go out during lunchtime at school, to find those who were excluded and to invite them to eat with us. I didn't know anything about Jesus. I didn't know anything about his teachings, but this is the first taste I had. And the power was real. Those who were excluded began to come. The scriptures were open, not in a theological way, not in a way that belonged to a certain church or to a certain denomination. Domination, maybe a slip there. What domination are you a part of? Denomination, but just the words of Jesus. And so bringing those who were excluded, those who were eating alone, that's what we would do. We'd find those who were eating alone and just invite them. Do you want to eat with us? And eventually that grew to sharing meals. It grew to opening the scriptures. And then 2 years later, it became every single lunch was packed with kids just wanting, of all different walks of life, just wanting to hear about Jesus. This is the first experience I had in the Jesus movement. Unfortunately, I've been through many things since then, and I've seen very little of that because the American church does not embrace. The American church does not resist. The American church, just like the religious system of Jesus' day, seems to be tied into imperial power, and they want comfort over disruption. They want power over justice. But I've seen it with my own eyes, the power of the table. I can truly say my first experience was the redefinition of power before I even knew many of the words of Jesus. His people showed me, and it'll always stick with me. Because, again, the way of Jesus is not a message, it's a method. The way of Jesus is not passive, it's provocative, and it still threatens empire. So if part 2 is about Jesus' practice revolution, part 3 is about what happened next. So next time on Gospel Politic, we move from the individual to the collective. We explore how the early church became a community of resistance, caring for plague victims, sharing resources, defying empire through tenderness and solidarity, because the empire didn't end with Jesus, it multiplied. So join me for part 3, Jesus and his community of revolution, where the church became the movement. I'm John, and this is Gospel Politic, where faith meets justice and truth refuses to stay silent.